Table saws can be dangerous and intimidating, but don't worry, help is at hand. Today I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about table saws, including how to use them safely. Table saws are one of the most versatile tools in the workshop. Having said that, most of the cuts you can make on a table saw, you can also do on a circular saw or track saw or even a band saw. But the advantage of using a table saw is that it's highly accurate for repeat cuts, and quite often it's easier to move the piece of wood through the saw rather than the saw through the material. The saw I'm using today is an Evolution Rage 5, which I think is a medium to entry level saw that's got a 1500 watt motor and a 10-inch or a 255mm blade. When you unbox the Rage 5, there is a certain amount of assembly to be carried out, especially around the movable table or stand that it sits on. Evolution were kind enough to send me this Rage 5 recently after I made such a fuss about not owning a table saw, so thank you Evolution. And because they knew I was featuring this saw in the video today, they've been good enough to arrange a 10% discount right across their range for the rest of May. They're also currently throwing in the £58 fine wood blade into the Rage 5 bundle and a t-shirt if you buy from them direct. So go and have a look at their range. I'll put a link in the description below, and don't forget to use the code PROPERDIY to get your 10% discount. Just about all of the assembly here is to do with the stand rather than the saw itself. So after about 20 minutes I had something together looking like the pictures in the instructions. Having a saw like this on a movable stand suits me because it's not the sort of tool that I'm going to be using every day of the week. So to have it on a stand so I can easily move it to the side of the workshop gets it out the way when I'm not using it. Once I had it assembled, I changed the blade to this finer 60 tooth wood blade, which I'm going to be using today. The blade I'm taking off here is the multi-purpose blade that comes supplied with the saw, and it's like a multi-purpose cut through anything type of blade that comes as standard. The components and anatomy of every table saw, either entry level or professional, are pretty much the same. You have a flat metal table that's made up of different material depending on the quality of your saw, with a saw blade that can be raised or lowered coming out of it that actually turns towards you, which means when you push the wood through the blade, it's essentially cutting in the same way as a circular saw, just the other way round, and you're pushing the wood through the blade rather than the blade through the wood. The blade can also be leant over to one side to cut bevel cuts, although obviously when you're doing this, the depth of cut changes because the saw blade is a fixed length and you can't have it both ways. On this particular saw, the fine adjustment for leaning it over is done by pushing in this rotary knob, then locking it off once you get the right angle. But we'll come back to this in a minute. Around the blade is this plastic insert that when you take out allows you to be able to change the blade and get through to the arbor. Although it does have some holes in it to allow you to change the angle of the bevel, which means that it does start getting a little bit tricky cutting very thin material. And this is where people refer to zero clearance inserts, which means there's hardly any gap between the insert and the blade, which means you can really cut thin slivers of wood without the risk of them falling down the hole. Just behind the blade is what's called a riving knife. Now this flat piece of metal helps ensure that the wood going through the blade stays parallel to it throughout the cut. Without this, there's a possibility of the timber snagging on the blade if it's twisted, and then you end up with something called kickback, which is where rather than the blade going through the timber, the blade grabs the timber and throws it back in your direction. This isn't recommended. So my advice is to never cut on a table saw without a riving knife. You really are asking for trouble. Another important feature on every table saw is dust extraction, although some can be more effective than others. Even standard softwood dust can be harmful depending on the levels inhaled. So it's really important to set up a saw like this using adequate dust collection, as table saws are able to make dust at an alarming rate. When it comes to the size of the tops of table saws, there's a variety of sizes, but quite commonly on a saw, a bit like the one on here, they'll have adjustable wings that can be pulled out to help support the material. It's also very common for people to build table saws into a workbench, which have a larger outfeed table. But the disadvantage of this is it does mean that you can't easily fold the saw up and put it in the corner. A table saw that's built into a bench tends to stay there and to be your centerpiece of your workshop forever. To ensure wood is pushed through the blade parallel to it, all table saws will come supplied with a fence. This moves from side to side and allows you to set the distance between the fence and the blade, which in turn will be the width of your cut. One of the adjustments you need to make before starting to use your saw is to make sure that the fence is parallel to the blade, or else your cuts won't be accurate, you're going to have a hard time pushing the materials through, and you've got a higher risk of kickback. Also, if you're looking to buy a table saw, check the fence to see if it naturally ends up in the same relative alignment to the blade each time it's adjusted and locked off. Some fences have a tendency of ending up within a slightly different angle each time they're locked off, which really isn't good, and you'll really struggle to end up with decent cuts. Most saws come with their own measuring scales, and I found on this particular saw I can set it up and it's quite accurate. But if you don't want to do that, or if it's impossible to set up, you can just use a tape measure and just measure physically between the edge of the blade and the side of the fence. But if you can get the scale to work accurately, you'll find that that is a quicker way of making your cuts and quite a nice feature. The other thing that table saws come with is a mitre fence, which runs up and down these slots on either side of the blade. This can be used to support timber while you're pushing it through the blade, and obviously to carry out angled cuts. By using a mitre fence set at an angle and using the bevel function on the blade, you can end up cutting a compound mitre. As well as a mitre fence, this particular saw has the added benefit that one part of the tabletop can slide with the mitre fence fixed in place. This helps support the material better, and because this section of the table that moves is quite long, I found that there's less side to side play in this than in the traditional mitre fence. So I think that's enough talk. Let's get on and make some cuts. Obviously full PPE is highly recommended for a job like this, and when I'm using a dust mask and eye protection, I must admit I prefer to use these earplugs rather than the big over the head ear protection, because it's just something else that doesn't get in the way. Now today we're going to be using the guard over the blade. Looking in the instructions, it recommends always using a guard, so that's what I'm going to be doing, and it also helps with dust collection as well. And obviously I'm going to be using my famous classic yellow gloves as well, because if there's ever a time that you really want to make sure you don't slip with a piece of timber, now is it. So let's put on the guard. Just make sure it works. I start by cutting a 40mm rip from a thin piece of MDF. Because of the length of this piece, I'm able to use my hands to start feeding it through, applying sideward pressure with my left hand to keep it tight up against the fence until it gets a little bit too short, and then I swap over to using my push sticks to complete the cut. Next I set up the mitre fence. If you're using a stop block with a mitre fence, firstly position it near the blade so you can set the cut. Then once the fence is locked in place, pull it back away from the blade. This means that once you start the cut and the wood is passing through the blade, there's nothing on the right hand side of it, and it's well away from the stop block with no chance of kickback. Oh, dear me. So just one thing I want to just stress and talk a little bit about is kickback, because if you understand kickback, then you can carry out 99% of your cuts safely. So I'm going to take the guard off here and unplug it so I can explain what I mean. So kickback is when the piece of timber gets stuck with the blade and tends to shoot back at you. And more often or not, rather than shooting straight back, it actually starts rotating as well. Let me show you what I mean. If this piece of ply got stuck between the blade and the fence here, then potentially this part of the blade here comes in contact with the ply and starts wanting to push it back. It will probably also rotate it, so it starts flying at you. And the reason for that is that it's basically stuck with nowhere to go, and once it snags, it's going to move. So if you are cutting a small piece like this, you've got to really push it all the way through the blade until it goes past the end of the blade to safety, else there is that chance that it comes back at you. And also, you must never ever use the mitre fence and the standard rip fence at the same time. That is a sure way of getting something stuck in between the two that will have a high potential of kickback. This wants to be out the way, so when you push through, if there is any tendency, this just tends to move out the way rather than spinning towards you. So if you understand that principle, then you can really then decide yourself what you can put through the blade safely and how to cut each piece. So as it is, I need a few shelves for my little mini greenhouse outside, and this is the perfect tool to make them on, because once I've set that width between the fence and the blade, then I can run everything through and get exactly the same width on all the shelves in both directions. So this is the quickest way of doing it. So let's get on and do that now. So that is 4 shelves, exactly the same to the nearest sort of 1/10 of a millimetre, including the cuts and the chamfers on the corner, in double quick time. Let's just hope they fit. So the shelves all fit, and that's a nice little job out the way. Oh, that looks a bit dangerous, doesn't it? But the power is off, so I should be okay. So as you can see, the table saw is a really versatile piece of kit, but you mustn't let it intimidate you. But as long as you follow the rules and understand the principles behind them, especially the one about kickback, once you understand that, then you should be able to run any timber through it time and time again completely safely. Then it becomes a really useful piece of kit in your workshop. So go and have a look at the Evolution website. I'll put a link in the description below, and remember to use my code PROPERDIY and you get 10% off everything they do. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and maybe you've learned one or two things along the way. If you have, please check out the other ones on the channel, and please go and check out our Patreon page where there's additional material and additional weekly videos as well. So I've enjoyed cutting timber so much on this. I think I'm going to find some more. See you next week.